In New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and other major cities across the country, people are talking about gentrification. Recently, I've been speaking to people randomly about gentrification. And one thing I learned is that people have generally heard the term, but they're not quite familiar with what it exactly means. One guy said, "Isn't that when neighborhoods become new, or is it when they are old and they get kind of revitalized?" Our understandings of gentrification are quite confused. But defining gentrification merely as neighborhood improvement is overly simplistic. Gentrification is much more complicated. I think most people think about gentrification in terms of the adaptive reuse of historic or dilapidated structures like the High Line, or the development of high-rise luxury buildings, the proliferation of retail of all sorts, cafes, the wine bars, and the like, or the restoration of 19th century brownstones or Victoria-era homes. While these factors are correlated with gentrification, they don't truly define gentrification. The term gentrification refers to processes by which higher income or higher status people relocate to or invest in low-income urban neighborhoods. These neighborhoods have historically been disinvested by both the public and private sector. And so as higher income people move to these areas, it's typically to capitalize on the low property values. In doing so, they inflate property values, displace low-income people, and fundamentally alter the culture and character of the neighborhood. Tom Slater describes gentrification, he's an urban geographer, he describes gentrification as the spatial expression of economic inequality, or the way in which inequality plays out in our neighborhoods and communities. I think another point we have to remember is that gentrification is further confounded by the legacy of racial inequality in America. The neighborhoods that are gentrifying across the country are disproportionately occupied by Black and brown people. Thus, Black and brown people are disproportionately being displaced. And typically, they're being displaced by the influx of white people. This dynamic, you can imagine, causes all sorts of tensions. So when we put gentrification into its appropriate context, and understand that it's a manifestation of inequality, and it demands that we start thinking about preventative strategies and policies that can ameliorate gentrification. But in order to do that, we must first address some of the misconceptions. I'm going to address 3. As I mentioned, gentrification is not the same as revitalization. Revitalization refers to neighborhood change, improvement, upgrading, but it's done from the bottom up. It's usually done with community residents and community organizations, often with the help of public and private sector, but they're improving housing, attracting businesses to the corridor, making the neighborhood safe and clean. But the most important point in revitalization is that the neighborhood remains affordable for low-income people. The second point I want to address is perhaps the most kind of adverse effect of gentrification, and that's displacement. I think experts generally agree that gentrification causes displacement. That's not news to most of us. We debate over the magnitude of gentrification. Part of the issue is that there are different ways of thinking about displacement. There is both indirect displacement and direct displacement. We also describe indirect displacement as exclusionary displacement. But first I'll address the direct displacement. So imagine that you've been living in a neighborhood 5 years, 10 years. You've been paying anywhere between $18 and $2,000 a month. And then suddenly your landlord tells you that when your lease is up in 60 days, your rent's going up to $3,000. When faced with a 50 to 65% increase in rent, what do? Most people have no choice. They have to leave. That's direct displacement. Exclusionary displacement is actually more insidious. By that, I mean, well, think of it this way. If in many New York City neighborhoods, there are pockets of protected units, which we would refer to as rent-controlled units or rent-stabilized units or even public housing, right? In those few units, people can actually remain in place. So exclusionary displacement then refers to the sense of isolation that people feel when their family and friends have been displaced. Their social network may be eroded, although they can remain in place. It also refers to the sense of isolation people feel from the influx of high-end restaurants and boutiques that they can't afford. So it's great that your neighborhood is aesthetically appealing, but if all you can do is window shop, it doesn't feel so great. Again, another point that causes different forms of contestation. And then the final point of exclusionary displacement refers to what happens kind of over time. Over time, what we notice is that even people in the protected units decide to leave. And well, it may be their own decision. They have agency in leaving. They're leaving because the neighborhood feels unfamiliar. Their community feels unfamiliar. So you can imagine how all of these processes start to create conflicts on the ground. The third point with regard to gentrification that I want to mention is that gentrification is fundamentally a social justice problem. It's not a quasi-collective good in which most people benefit, only a few are made worse off. It's quite the contrary. I think you all are quite familiar with our real estate market, and in cities like New York, they're increasingly becoming destinations for investment in luxury real estate. At the same time, average New Yorkers can't afford to remain in place. And some people describe this process, or they look at this inflated real estate market as a boon for the city, right? The tax revenue, property tax revenue is going up. However, if you think about the 10-year tax abatements that are associated with some of the new developments, or the generous subsidies, or the 20-year exemptions, tax exemptions that real estate developers get, you can understand that the tax revenue that we expected is not actually accruing to the city. However, sales tax is going up, and that is good for the city. But it's at a high price for a lot of people. I think there are a number of studies out there, and we kind of attempt to try to measure this thing called gentrification and its effect on different neighborhood outcomes, like schools or crime. And there's a lot of debate, and I think in general, many studies have found that schools in gentrified neighborhoods are not improved, although crime is going down. However, crime is going down across the city. So again, I think it's a far more complicated dynamic. And the debate about the measuring of gentrification is really only important when it comes to the statistical models that a lot of academics use, because the lived experience of gentrification is real, and it doesn't vary with regard to the measures that we choose. And so in a lot of the studies that I do, I think about the different neighborhoods across New York City that have gentrified over different periods. And so if I use different measures, inevitably I will come up with different outcomes in terms of which neighborhoods have gentrified. But again, I fully understand that this is somewhat irrelevant when it comes to how people are experiencing gentrification. So understanding that gentrification is a social justice problem means that we should be thinking more critically about strategies, about progressive policies. I think it points to a set of actions that we can take. So for instance, when talking, blogging, tweeting about gentrification, understanding it's a social justice problem means not using glib comments like, well, neighborhoods always change. Right? This is not a natural process. And since gentrification is a problem that can be addressed, right? This isn't something that we can't do anything about. I'll just list a couple of things we can think about. So for one, we can think about policies that implement some form of rent control. We can think about policies that implement some form of progressive land tax, such that the incremental tax is used to support the most vulnerable renters. We can also think about restricting predatory investment schemes. And lastly, think about restricting these speculatory kind of investment funds that attract accredited investors to invest in these high-growth neighborhoods, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, Harlem, Bushwick, and so forth. Another thing we should be thinking about is thinking very critically about the representations of the neighborhoods that we're saying are gentrifying, both in New York and across the country. We often use these very bleak and dire kind of urban landscapes to say these neighborhoods are prime for unfettered development. But I think once we put it in context, we know that that's not necessarily appropriate. And finally, the final thing we need to think about is acting early to prevent gentrification, to prevent displacement. So I say all that, but I recognize that everyone needs to live somewhere. So my point here is really to get us to think more critically about gentrification and what we can do. So I'll leave you with this. Because I think gentrification is fundamentally about social justice, and social justice is a value, I have an example that I want to share with you. In 1992, when New York City was hungry for development, the Department of City Planning had the foresight to use land use rules and zoning regulations to ensure that our waterfront across the city would be accessible to all New Yorkers into the future. The argument against such an action was that any kind of rule or regulation would stymie development. Well, it clearly didn't, right? We know that didn't happen. But what's important there is that the Department of City Planning had a vision. They attached their vision to a value, and they acted so that we have access. Gentrification is something we can do something about it, we can use policy, but it really comes down to what we value, who we value, and how we want to act upon that. So thank you.